So hello, everyone. My name is Sertaç Seyrikoğlu. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Global Prosperity. I've been the lead organizer of this term's speaker series, Dreams, Desires, and Aspirations, Imaginative Landscapes of Prosperity, a title we owe to Alex Pim. I saw somewhere here. Yeah, he's raising his hand. At the IGP, we are working towards a new model of prosperity for the 21st century, reworking the way we conceive and run our economies, our societies, and our relationship with the planet. Our social and collective imaginaries, dreams, and aspirations are at the core of that mission, not only in understanding how people strive towards ideas of prosperity, but in unearthing how and why different ideas are constructed as they are. And therefore, this time we are inviting scholars, novelists, politicians, artists, and filmmakers. And as you have seen last week, sometimes all of these categories can be in one person, to help us excavate some of the imaginary forces that brought prosperity to where it is today and where it might be taken tomorrow. And today we are very thrilled and lucky to have one of those multi-talented polymaths, I can say, I guess, Anil Madhavapeddy. He is a great friend of mine. He's a professor of planetary computing at the University of Cambridge Computer Laboratory. He co-leads a number of very exciting projects, some of which to mention are the Energy and Environment Group at Cambridge, and also co-directs the Center for Earth Observation and the Cambridge Center for Carbon Credits. I wish you guys had a moment of social with him so that you would know where his energy will come from, or you would be completely lost as to how. It's just he manages it. The center aims to increase the integrity of natural climate solutions that contribute towards ending deforestation and improving biodiversity globally via the application of modern remote sensing and statistical techniques to reduce the overheads of verifying interventions. He has decades of experience with constructing internet-scale systems and has contributed to open-source projects such as OCaml, Docker, Zen, OpenBSD, with users ranging from all major cloud computing providers to governments worldwide. So please join me in welcoming Professor Anil.
Thank you, Sertaç. Thank you very much. Good to see you all. So as Sertaç said, for the past 20 years, I've done a lot of work on building conventional computing systems that help to scale up the cloud. And about 4 years ago, I decided that was just really dull. And there's actually a whole bunch of planetary crises that need to be addressed. And so myself, along with my colleague Keshav in Cambridge, decided that we wanted to switch our computer science work over to anything that will try to help the planet in terms of the various crises kind of facing it right now. And so the work I'm going to talk about here is in collaboration with lots and lots of friends and colleagues across departments in Cambridge, from computer science to zoology to plant sciences. And we all work inside the David Attenborough building. So that's not Boris Johnson up there, that's David Attenborough. And he's rappelling down at the age of 82, the living wall inside our place in order to open our building. And the basic thing happening right now is that if you look around, especially in the media or any of the kind of scientific reporting journals, there's a whole spectrum of crises kind of hitting the world right now, right? And sometimes it's really hard to disentangle all these. How do we know which of these crises are actually the important ones, which ones have some causation factors that we can actually make a difference in fixing? But really the common linkage between these is that they are highly interconnected. And the reality right now is that we're living in quite a crowded world. And as the world gets more crowded, we need to figure out exactly how we might be able to address some of these highly interlocked situations. And so this overall thing was from the World Economic Forum report on global risks. And something leapt out of me when I read this. I'd actually encourage everyone to read it. It's less depressing than you might think. When you read this thing, there's a bunch, when you rank some of these crises, there's a whole bunch of things which are very short term, right? So things like misinformation. We're in the middle of a US election cycle right now. We've just finished the UK election cycle. There's cybersecurity problems. There's inflation in the economies, the things we worry about day to day for living our lives. And there's only just a few things where we're beginning to worry about: extreme weather events, pollution that is affecting our health. But these are, not that dominant in the list of things right now. But then, when you look at the list ranked by what do people worry about 10 years from now, it's a completely different story. So because there, you're worrying about a lot more things in green. We're worrying about extreme weather events and hurricanes getting even more frequent, but we're also worrying about our planet. What will be the fundamental changes to what we're seeing on Mother Earth? What is happening to biodiversity and our ecosystems? And generally, these rank up very highly in terms of our 10-year risks. So now, isn't it weird that we have 10 years comes up in no time at all, and yet we are worrying about those always a decade away and not right now? So what I'm trying to figure out is, what do we need to do for the next 2 years, and the next 2 years, and the next 2 years, such that we can make sure we address these inevitable things around natural resources right now? And then this way, we can hopefully tackle what will eventually be a huge problem a few decades from now, and try to figure out what the reasonable things we can do here are. And I'm going to describe to you these in terms of computer science and technology. And at the end, I'd like you to come up with questions that challenge this and think about this through the lens of climate justice, of global equity, of accessibility to people. And I'll spend some time talking about that as well. And this is where I need help. So I need your ideas and your inputs in order to give us ideas and where we can take this to make it accessible to the people in the world that need it the most. So the overall problem is that the world's land is now pretty much used up. It turns out that it's either used for human activities like agriculture, or it's used for wildlife. That is, we're trying to leave this for the world's natural beings. And the good news to some extent is that human population is due to peak in 2080. So it's going to rise to 10.8 billion people by 2080. By 2100, it's going to be stabilizing for the foreseeable future, for the next century, at 10.2 billion people. So this is the first time in human history that we know how many humans there are. These humans are going to move around, but in terms of the total population, we now know what our limits are. And so now the question we're trying to answer is, how do we balance our world's usage of the land, either for the natural purposes or for human joy and existence and all of the other things that we do ourselves? And the challenges are that right now we're doing a pretty bad job of figuring out how to manage this. If this was a student house like I used to have when I was a student, then the dishes are dirty, no one's really doing the laundry, and everything is kind of a bit of a mess in the living room right now. And there's three real main reasons why that is. The first one is that we're all pumping emissions into the atmosphere. And so this graph shows us global emissions worldwide. There was a brief dip in the pandemic when travel and a lot of human activity slowed down, and it shows us a hint of what might be if we all cooperated. But really, emissions continue to increase right now. So the atmosphere is getting hotter and hotter, and so we're entering a world where it's going to be hotter and wetter over the next 100 years. And then, in the natural land surface, we have a whole bunch of things that are just trying to live their lives, all of the non-human species in the world. And for them, there's been a huge drop in the number of regularly counted species for almost every taxonomy. So a recent WWF report said that for the regularly counted species, the ones we know about, there's been about a 60 to 90% drop in their quantities in the last 50 years. And so since 1970, we've seen that almost every single species is moving towards either something we don't know much about, data deficient, or the ones are moving towards more and more extinction. So they're running out of land as well. And so we need to figure out how we can protect and preserve and defend their land against our activity. And then, in the middle of all of this, the things that connects all of these ecosystems together is water. So there was a report that came out just last week from the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, and they observed that for the first time in human history, we have fundamentally shifted the global water table in such a way that it's actually just going to be different in terms of where the water falls and where it ends up. And there's really two different kinds of water. There's the blue water, which falls from the sky and it's used for a whole bunch of things. And there's green water, which is the huge amount of water contained inside plants and the soil. And so both of these coexist in order to make sure that the water cycle in the world is good. And of course, we can get by without food for a certain amount of time, but we really can't exist without water for even a very, very short period of time. So all of these things are all to do with land use, right? What do we do with every piece of the world's land surface to make sure that we can do the best thing for all of these three concerns? You can't look at just one of them. They're interlocked. You have to look at all three, right, to figure it out. And so ultimately, every single one of our land use decisions has a consequence. If we, for example, expand London, then we'll reduce the amount of wild land remaining. Or if we were to do some restoration activity somewhere and we reduce the amount of land available for humans, somewhere else in the world might be converted. And across all of this, we have to regulate water tables and entire global resources to make sure that we can balance the books heading into the next 50 years. We don't have to do this forever. We only have to do this until the human population stabilizes. So the next 30 to 40 years, that is the next the next years where all of you in your generation will be the most active in your careers, is when this critical action will happen. So this is why I'm trying to set the groundwork up for all of you to have the data that you can use to make sure you do positive actions in the world with respect to these crises. And so this is the thesis behind this new form of computer science, where we're saying that there's a whole bunch of data in the world that we need to figure out, right? We need to capture all kinds of data from all kinds of sources, and we need to make it easier to put it into the hands of environmental scientists who are working either on the natural areas, the conservation science, or on the human areas, the environmental scientists that make our cities more usable and livable, and also into the hands of politicians to make sure that the next few decades of politics are evidence-driven and data-driven, and actually show that the actions that we're taking are the most effective using the information available to us. That is, we have to shift to an evidence-driven posture for making decisions both locally and globally as well. And so where do we start by doing this? I'm going to just quickly in this talk go through three different areas that are interconnected, that affect this, and then show you how interconnected the world is. I'm going to first of all talk about tropical forests, and then going to talk about how to measure the world's biodiversity, and then I'm going to talk about how this connects up with what we eat. We've all hopefully just had lunch, and so you can see what the impact of the food that we eat has on the natural world as well. And then ultimately, we want this to be interconnected. We want to make sure that the more we learn about each of these things, the more we can feed that into how we manage the other pieces of the world as well. Okay? And if at any point any of you have questions, just raise your hands and interrupt me, and I'll answer them on the spot. So don't be shy to ask for clarifications as we go through the talk. So the first thing to do is to figure out where in the world might we find the highest impact and the highest rate of return for focusing our efforts in our data gathering. How many of you have ever been to a tropical rainforest in the world? Just put your hands up if you have. Brilliant. Shada, where have you been? Go. I saw about at least 20 hands go. Go on. Okay, Paula, I heard one. Yeah. Anyone been to Brazil? Amazon, you've been to Brazil, Peru. So there's really 5 major tropical rainforests in the world. We've got the Amazon, we've got Colombia, we've got the Congo area in Sierra Leone. Has anyone been to the African rainforests? Oh, you've been there. Excellent. Okay, that's a good. We'll see that in more detail soon. And then we have Indonesia and we have Madagascar, where the eastern side of Madagascar is an incredible place to visit. And so these 5 tropical rainforests are home to 2/3 of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, and probably more when combined with South Africa for the world's rare plant species that have not been discovered yet. And so they're all being cut down at a faster rate than we've ever done so in human history before. This year has seen more tropical forests disappear, and in our lifetimes, they will be gone entirely. And so this means not only that we'll lose a lovely bit of nature, we'll just lose 2/3 of the world's species that only live in those regions. To all of you that have been there, you know that it is an incredibly rich and diverse and dense kind of area of the world because of its properties. It's been climatically stable for a long time, and there's lots of stuff live there. So the first thing to do is to say, if your house is burning down, you don't go and do some cleaning, you put the fire out. And so the first priority is, how do we stop these old forests from being cut down? Because then afterwards, we can worry about restoration and all of those things. And so what we're trying to figure out is, how can we come up with sustainable livelihoods that provide a green alternative to cutting down these forests. Right now, the forests are being used and they're being paid to do cocoa, coffee, soya, palm oil, and cattle. And these are so profitable that you just cut down the rainforest and you plant the crops there. But if there is an alternative, that would be awesome, right? Where we can figure out how we can do this. And one of the examples here, we've been working with the RSPB, is one I will just show you quickly over here. Now, can you hear this all over the mic?
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going deep in the forest today. I'm very, very, very happy.
So we're now in Sierra Leone in the global rainforest.
I'm here to protect this forest and biodiversity. I love it. Love the forest.
Angola is one of the most magical places in the world I've ever been. There's clouds drifting through the mist in the morning, incredibly noisy all the time. Birds everywhere. And this is one of the last remaining lowland tropical forests in Africa at the moment, along with the Congo. And every time you see it, you see all kinds of incredible species over there. You've got chimpanzees, pygmy hippos, there's a lot going on anytime we're over there, and an incredible number of birds. And this one in particular is super cute.
I joke in the forest. I'm a jogger. I like to share the forest with the visitors.
You do ecotourism and various activities.
And nice with the catharsis. Like sensitive, whatever I'm sorry, the catharsis, they are right in the primary forest, they are really a shy.
It took us 3 days to see one when we were trekking through the forest. And so what we're also doing here is to say that to protect this forest, we use a scheme called REDD+. And what REDD+ is saying that if we do an alternative livelihood, we want to measure how much of the forest is being protected because of our scheme, so that we can then provide the difference in the profits to the local people. So that we should be able to find ways of making money. And if that is not a profitable mechanism, you can use other financing mechanisms to make it profitable. And so therefore we provide competition against palm oil and all of the things that are cutting down the rainforest right now. And then we can find more intensive ways of making that particular profit.
Cocoa farmer.
So this is the alternative livelihood.
I like the forest because the relationship between the forest and the cocoa is very important. For those that were planting very close to the forest, we will continue harvesting to the end of March. But for those that are far away from the forest, we will stop harvesting around January. Yeah.
Has everyone seen inside a cocoa plant?
Yeah.
This is where your chocolate comes from?
A lot of practices to us. They give us a lot of training, like the nursery, pruning, how to harvest the cocoa pod from the tree, how to ferment the leaf, and they also train us how to dry it.
And crucially, this is happening without cutting down the forest. This is happening as a mixed growth plantation inside the forest itself. And then lots and lots of people are supported through the scheme in order to make sure that there's a cooperative mechanism. And then this is done in concert with the chiefs of Sierra Leone. And so it's all community owned as well. So what I'm going to do now is stop that one and go back to what I was saying. And so if you come up with these schemes, this is kind of a green new economy. These are schemes that benefit the locals, they preserve the natural environment, and ideally share some of the prosperity that we are seeing in the global north with the locals that live here. So in the case of the chocolate that you just saw, you can buy that chocolate from the RSPB website. The RSPB is the international charitable agency that is managing that project, and they sell the cocoa in the form of products, and then those profits go directly to the locals as well. So this is generally a win-win. Also, I would have brought some chocolate, but I ate all of it, unfortunately. So you can buy your own, and it's totally worth it, right? From there, you can see that down over there in the global rainforest one. So the problem next is, how do we know worldwide we're going to need thousands of these projects in order to succeed at what we're going to do? So how do we know if any one of these interventions that we put anywhere in the world is working or failing? And right now, the way that these projects work is that we ask them at the beginning of the project, what do you think you're going to do? And if you succeed, how you tell us how you will measure yourself. And the problem with that, of course, is that every project has a different way of measuring themselves. And so you can't compare any projects. So if you're an aid agency or a government, you have no way of knowing whether or not one project in Colombia is doing better than another project in Indonesia or better than a project here in Sierra Leone. So we need some way of creating metrics to objectively analyze and compare these things. And the problem with self-reporting is also it opens up the market for anyone who just wants to be to make some money off this finance, which harms the local people because you get a lot of people just trying to do their own thing. So we said, well, this is where computer science comes in. Why don't we try something a little bit different? Why don't we say that we can measure quantitatively from space trees? They're the one thing that you can measure from space pretty reliably, right? Every tree, especially in a forest, you can see from outer space. And then we're not going to try to measure everything about a project. The things like the local livelihoods, the community frameworks, we're not going to measure those from space. But we're going to remove from the equation all of the manual things that people have to do to measure their projects. And we can provide objective, comparable mechanisms and then focus the actual humans in the project on the issues of justice and improving livelihoods. Otherwise, people are spending their time literally measuring trees by hugging them and then reporting those laboriously day in and day out. And that's how we do verification right now. It's not good enough. And so the good news is that from outer space, we have more satellites up there measuring more about our planet than we've ever had in human history. So we've got over 1,000 these days Earth observation satellites, lots of communication satellites to bring the internet all over the world now. But really, we're concerned about Earth observation. What can we learn about the Earth just by looking at it from outer space? And since 1984, there's been a satellite launched by NASA called Landsat. And Landsat pioneered this idea of satellites as a public good. So all of the data and all of the observations from NASA Landsat have been available for anyone to download and use. So any of you can just go to their website and download them. They're very large, but they're free. And then this led the way for many, many other mechanisms, such as the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, to do all of these things. And the way these satellites work is that they skim around the Earth, and then you have to use a lot of computational resource to create the kind of maps that you're seeing. And then what those maps do is that they let us form a view. Now, I think the colors might be a little bit off here, but you might be able to see it. Since 1990 to 2021, we can actually start measuring at a very coarse-grained level what global deforestation looks like. So here you're seeing, this is the frontier of deforestation across the Amazon. So all of the orange represents some degraded land. And you can see some patterns here. For example, we're not just deforesting right in the middle, it's inaccessible, but anywhere where there's roads or any kind of supply chain is where the human activity begins. So it's clear that there's some of this rainforest is under danger and some of it is not. So we want to focus our finance efforts on where the danger is, right? Because that's where the deforestation will happen. And that's where you want to make sure that we can intervene as quickly as possible. But to do that, we need more details. Each of these orange dots represents a huge area because we're looking at this from space. So how do we get even more detailed so we can see exactly what is going on down there? So you can solve almost any problem with a giant laser in space. So what we've done is on the International Space Station, there is the same kind of technology that we use in self-driving cars, and except that it's in space and it's massive. And what this laser does is that it tracks the surface of the Earth from the International Space Station. And that International Space Station goes in an east-west orbit across the planet. So it doesn't quite capture the poles, but it captures the equator region that we care about for tropical forests. And the way that it works, it's got instruments that are so sensitive that we can detect when astronauts on the space station are going to the toilet because they flush. And they're very regular, actually, so it's good. They're eating very well up there. But the idea is that the bounce responses coming back from these lasers give us really fine-grained data, not just about what it looks like, but also what the shape of the planet is as well. So we can start to form views of the canopies and so on to get a much, much richer three-dimensional view of the entire planet. And then what this looks like is our maps are now combining lots of instruments, so lots and lots of data, but it's three-dimensional. You can get a sense of how wet it is, how high it is, what the exact shape is, and what all the reflectances are. And this is then sufficient to start almost counting every single tree on the planet and measuring how much carbon, for example, it's storing inside it. So you can get a really accurate view of what it is. It's very complex to figure this out. So this is a bird's eye view of a tropical rainforest. And these are us using some machine learning techniques to figure out where the trees are. Because the trees are all connected, it's not obvious, right? You might have clouds over it. And really, you have to eyeball it quite carefully to figure out how many individual trunks there are. So there are limitations to what we can do, but you can see that this is us segmenting different species in a tropical rainforest. And there are hundreds of previously undiscovered species because that's where the diversity of trees are. If you look in Scandinavia, you'll see a bunch of trees we can predict. Over there are hundreds and hundreds of subtly different species that many of which have not been discovered yet. So this rich data is letting us kind of build up views of where we need to go to figure out things about those particular trees. So then, if you think about how we deal with understanding if something is useful or not, if I'm, for example, going to take some aspirin in medicine, there's been a very long history of randomized controlled trials. So we can figure out, based on a mechanism of using a placebo or using a control, whether or not something is effective. And the reason for this is because there's lots of cases where you might want to isolate one particular variable. So in the case of aspirin, there might be lots of other reasons why I end up dying of something. I might have cancer, I might get hit by a bus. There's lots of things that could happen, right? So you're trying to isolate across two separate sets of people, which set of people were only affected by aspirin and not. And you want everything else to be as similar as possible. So we apply a similar kind of scheme in order to figure out how effective these mechanisms are. So we use this satellite data, and now we're going over Sierra Leone, and here, the border of Liberia and Sierra Leone, we are seeing that there's some rainforest, and this is the area that we've been protecting. So this is the Gola project that you just saw on the video. And what we do is we identify other areas that are as similar in terms of their elevation, their slope, their accessibility to roads, so that we know how hard it is to get things out there. And by doing this, we can figure out the only difference between this tree and this tree for this point is that this one is protected against any kind of agriculture or human activity. And so other things might kill these trees, like fires, floods, insects, wind, but human activity is isolated there. And then we can say, well, this is our control area. This is generally how much deforestation there is in Sierra Leone. And this is our conservation area. And then this represents the amount of forest that has been saved by this particular project. So you can treat it just like we do evidence-driven trials for drugs. And then you can also see, for example, in the background, how much deforestation is happening in Sierra Leone overall. And it's an incredible vista. It's just across the rest of the country. You can see here, it's a little protected area. And so these kind of interventions are having a big effect because across the rest of the country, normal human industry is just taken over and taken out human nature. So you can see how unbalanced nature is versus human activity. And so these little protection areas are some of the only ways we have to save these particular rainforests. So there's lots and lots of ways that we're putting the data from the satellites and then trying to calculate lots of factors about why things are happening across the world. And this involves lots and lots of computation. How many computer scientists or engineers do we have in the room, out of curiosity? How many people program? Oh, okay, so about 1 in 3 of you, I estimate, do some programming. And you'll know that if you program, it's kind of painful to have to deal with huge data. And so here, we're not just dealing with terabytes of data, we're dealing with petabytes of data. So every month, a huge amount of data comes in. And so we've developed lots of custom infrastructure to help us to do the computer science and to make it accessible as possible to people who are not involved in this. But the day-to-day activity when you do computer science is you have to look at all of these graphs and try to figure out which of my algorithms are correct. It's kind of very kind of detail-oriented and quite boring to people who are not into programming things. But one special thing happened in the middle of all this. We started working in this, and then we were working with ecologists and plant scientists, and they were looking over our shoulder, and they said, hey, this particular thing, if I had access to that, I can actually do some new conservation science. I can start to understand more about the planet than before, we did this. But they don't care about tropical forests. They care about something else. So they're looking at all of the data sets we're constructing, and they're learning more. And so what happened was that we ended up with some structure where we're taking observations about the world from satellites, then we're processing them in order to come up with some kind of metrics about them. For example, what is the total biomass of the world's trees? How much do they weigh? And then you can, from those, figure out how much carbon there is. You can then figure out how the forest will grow and so on. And ultimately, you're trying to come up with an estimation of the amount of carbon stored in the atmosphere. But then the same data sets, it turns out, you can reuse most of these things. You can add in a few more bits of data. So in this case, we're saying that where do animals live, which ones are at extinction risks, and then you can come up with models and measure where every single thing in the world lives and what its chances of extinction are. And so this is what we did next. So we moved away from tropical forests and said, well, can we figure out for the entire planet where natural things live and what their intensity is? So if you were to turn a bit of Milton Keynes into farmland versus if you're about to turn a bit of the middle of the Amazon into farmland, what is the relative kind of extinction risks of each of these species? And this involves a huge amount of data, right, from the satellites and stuff. But what I'm going to do is just give you an intuition about what this metric is, so you get a sense of what's going on. So this is the bush hyrax. It's about this big. It's the world's nearest relative to the elephant. And the elephants are scared of it. It's quite cute. It lives in sort of this area in East Africa, but that's a very coarse-grained map, right? So for this one species, what we figure out is, well, what is the range that this species lives in? Like generally, it lives in East Africa. It's been observed over the years in this area. It only likes certain altitudes. It doesn't like being really cold. It doesn't like being really hot. And it has a habitat preference. It prefers living in grassland. And then you can crunch all that together and come up with where on the planet does this live in quite a fine-grained way. So you know that which bits of land in the world does this live on. And then we repeat that for 40,000 different species. We combine all of the knowledge from the United Nations, from the conservation scientists, to say, well, if you put it all together, can we come up with one map that tells us more about where everything lives in terms of terrestrial species, not everything, but it's a way to get started. And it ends up constructing some beautiful maps. So these numbers suddenly turn into something that starts igniting your imagination a little bit more. So this map shows us red for mammals, blue for birds, yellow for reptiles, and green for amphibians. You can see amphibians stuff down there. And you can start to see how the colors of the equator all combine to form black sources of endemism, where some of the world's rarest species going to live there. And these give you maps that show you that some areas, like the middle of Australia, for example, are just not that important from a species diversity perspective, but other areas are much, much more important. And so it tells us for the first time, where should I do something from a human perspective, and what would the relative cost be in extinctions across the natural world? Because we know that if we're going to cut down one particular, so this is the area of habitat of the species, and we know that if we're going to cut down some of its area of habitat, that the more area of habitat that we cut down, the higher the risk of accelerating its extinction is. So there's always a chance of extinction, but if I were just to remove one of these squares from where it could live, it's not going to be that bad, right? But if I cut down over half of it, it's going to be pretty bad. And then if I only leave one, it'll be almost certain to go extinct because you've just not given it any room to live in. So there's this kind of theoretical area where you can cut it down. And so the math behind it, without dwelling on it for too long, is simply that you can say, well, if we were to convert any one bit of land for all species, how will they be affected by this bit of land being changed? And then you can assess a score for that that says, if we were to convert some nature to human use, what would be the impact? And if we were to restore it from human use to nature, how much would it help these species and increase their chance of survival? So it gives you a way of measuring the human impact on nature. And so this is the conversion map, which means destroying nature, but for human use. So that's destroying nature is not always a bad thing because we have to live as well. And then restoring it says, if we were to restore these areas, it would connect up as many habitats as possible. So this way, we can start to form a view of the world's biodiversity as well. So these maps, they certainly kind of brought out some of the beauty of what the world looks like when looked through a lens of numbers, because you can really see how Europe in this is almost white. It's got almost nothing there. It's just we have some species, but we have nothing like the diversity of species that we have here. And so suddenly the focus of the data shifts you and your imagination into the equatorial regions where everything else that isn't human is suddenly in existence. And this is important. And then the last thing that we did was, okay, we've done all of this work, we've got all these beautiful maps and biodiversity. Where do humans kind of fit into all this? So what is the impact of the things that we eat on the biodiversity of all of these species? So suddenly we can take all of this complicated data, we can now add in supply chains, which is, where does your food come from? From the field to the fork, what route does it take? And we use satellites and all kinds of mechanisms with the Stockholm Environmental Institute to figure that out. And then this starts leading to some politically explosive results. So this is just a preprint here. So to emphasize, it's still under review. But what is going on here on the left-hand one first is that we're plotting for all of the land used to construct a different type of food. So this is a selection of some of the 150 foodstuffs that we eat as human beings. And then the higher it is on a logarithmic scale, so a little bit higher is a lot worse, is telling you how much you're shifting the probability of extinction of different species on the planet. And so up here, holding the throne, is ruminant meat. So any kind of beef or cattle, beef or sheep, for example, are ruminant red meat. And they just take a huge amount of land to produce versus the amount of protein they give someone. And then we have cocoa and coffee down here. And these are quite efficient to produce, but they're very small, right? So you need lots of land to produce a cup of coffee. And then all the way down here, you have vegetable. Interestingly enough, eggs and dairy they're not that bad. So there's a huge benefit to eating vegetables, not necessarily for going fully vegan. It all depends on exactly what the protein sources are, because usually vegan diets involve more soya, which shifts the land use into tropical forests, so that results in biodiversity. We're not judging veganism or vegetarianism. We're simply trying to measure their relative land use. And this all tells us kind of the global use of food. But then let's look at this at a country level. So at a country level, we can also measure to which countries is this food imported to and where is it consumed. So it turns out the USA eats a ridiculous amount of ruminant meat, of beef mainly. And so it causes a lot of damage, but most of it is domestically produced. Brazil also causes lots of damage to the Amazon, but 80% of the beef produced in Brazil is eaten in Brazil. The Brazilians love beef. So, this is part of their diet, is their choice mainly, and a relatively small amount is exported. Uganda, which has, malnutrition and generally has a lower protein per capita, still has, a reasonable domestic cost. India, which is traditionally lacto-vegetarian, it turns out they do eat a lot of beef because people just don't like reporting it. But it does happen. You can tell that from the import figures. And I asked my family, and I did confirm that this is true. I found a few beef eaters that I thought were vegetarian. But then look at where the crimes are being committed, right? So look at the UK and look at Japan. In this situation, we still have something quite comparable to these other countries, but all of the biodiversity impact is being imported here. We don't have the land to sustain our current lifestyle. And so we're buying lots of the food to sustain this lifestyle from other countries around the world and essentially causing harm to lots of other tropical forests, for example, in order to sustain our lifestyle. And now you got to think, is this just? Like, are we paying the right amount for bringing this food into the UK in order to sustain an unsustainable lifestyle? Or is there a true cost for this? Where should the money be spent? Like, should we be saying that if you live in an area that can naturally produce, for example, cattle efficiently, then it should be cheaper there? Or is it the case that globalization is just causing us to shift the blame and the cost of this kind of biodiversity harm all the way to the global south while we continue to just consume this food unsustainably? So this connection of data all the way from satellites to figuring out what's happening to tropical forests, to measuring biodiversity of the whole planet, to then ultimately connecting it up to food use, it's all connected. And then it lets us ask the questions that we need to ask to say that if we want to balance this, not just in the UK, not just in Europe, but all over the world, and try to come up with something more equitable and just, what do we need to do to make this happen? And if we were to modify any of these kind of bits of consumption, can we shift the behavioral demand in such a way that it will preserve much more nature than if we were just guessing and trying to make this stuff up? And this is, of course, super complicated because it involves lots and lots of data. And this is where techniques such as machine learning and AI are proving very, very useful. So without going into the details of all this stuff, if anyone's interested, there's a really good report from the Royal Society called Science in the Age of AI, which it essentially categorizes the different kind of machine learning techniques that we have these days into ways that we can search through lots of data in the past. We can also simulate very complicated systems such as forests and ecosystem services in ways that we could not do before. And also we can augment humans with co-pilots. I'm sure many of you have used ChatGPT. There are just even better ones now that are really kind of data driven. And so all of these things allow us to predict the past much more easily, to predict the future, to identify patterns of the past, to predict the future, but also to identify causation between these things. So we can say that if you are intervening in something, then will it have a causal effect and hopefully a positive impact on what we're trying to measure? Many of these things are correlations. They just happen. You can't measure, for example, women's BMI or infant mortality from space, but you can figure out what the causation factors are by looking into it deeply and identifying, for example, its distance from a Walmart in the US leads to obesity, or its distance from a food port that leads to malnutrition. Those are kind of causative factors in terms of supply chains. So for any of you, in all of your fields of endeavor, you will run into machine learning in the next few years. And so I encourage you to read, not necessarily the technical details of it, but read some of these reports to get a sense of the shape of machine learning, because it is one of the most transformative technologies I've encountered in terms of approaching large, complex, data-dense situations and trying to identify something from it. And then the essence of all of this is that we're not just using AI to automate this, we're using it to augment the human condition. We're trying to figure out how do we give access to this data to as many humans as we can, especially those in the global south, so they can start forming their own views and perspectives on what they need from all of this data to make sure that they can assure their own prosperity. And then this way, the future can be a negotiation and an equal negotiation between all of the countries, instead of us just dropping this data down onto the global south and just telling them that this is how we think the world should work. And that's the frontier of the research I'm doing at the moment, and what I want ideas from you on. So if you were to take some of these elements I've just talked about, how would you, first of all, explain it to people? Like, what is how do you turn this dry data into imagination through the form of visualizations, of art, of other forms of endeavor to explain some of these dimensions? And also, what is the negotiative process by which we can ensure equity and accessibility to this data all the way around the world as well? And certainly us computer scientists are really motivated to make sure that we can execute on those intentions, but we need your ideas and your background in order to kind of pull this off. So the future is going to be very, very interdisciplinary and involve lots of these kind of conversations. So reach out to me anytime that any of you have any ideas. Lots of papers and projects and things on the website. And it's been an absolute delight to talk to you for such an attentive audience. And I'd love to take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
But you know what, establish such a great rapport with the students. I'll just stand in here, and I'm kind of shutting myself up because I do have questions, but let's open the floor for questions first. Yes, please, over here, and then you.
Yeah, hi, Professor. I have a question. There is a research that published on the last week by the Global Commission on the Economic of Water,
Yep.
And they said that the water circle's balance has been broken down on the last week, and this is the first time for our Earth. And it's caused by the land loss and the green water loss.
Yep.
Even if we have so many technologies, like you said just now, we have observation or projects try to protect our land, but how it's like, but how it like becomes worse and worse.
Well, so that's a good question. So this is the image from that report from last week, and the basic problem is that there's a cycle of water, right? So it rains, the water is then stored as groundwater or is stored inside plants, and so the fundamental change that has happened here is that tropical rainforests are right in the middle of this cycle. So the reason they're called rainforests is because they emit lots of water, they transpire lots of the water inside the rainforest, and if you look at where the Amazon is at the edge of the Andes, right? So it's over here, and this is one of the biggest mountain ranges on the planet. So what happens is that 40% of the world's water comes over here. It combines with the water coming from the rainforest, and then it drops here, and it goes down the Amazon River, and you can go out 10 miles here and drink fresh water. So a huge amount of the world's rain ends up here, and it moves around. And if you cut down this rainforest is now at a 20% degradation rate. And in theory, if it loses enough area, around a third of it, then it will become a tropical grassland because it will not produce enough water and there will not be enough rain to sustain that density of trees. So it's basically deforestation and the use of groundwater that is causing this kind of imbalance. We have to reduce the amount of water we waste as humans, and we have to stop cutting down the forest, and then the balance will be restored. And we're just not doing enough of either. So there's a clear answer to water usage, really. Just don't waste water, and just be more responsible with it. And we have to do that everywhere, unfortunately, around the world.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Two questions. First, don't you think that knowing, like you said, Europe is basically a blank white thing on the map right now, but demanding from the global south not to cut their trees now that they're developing is very inequality approach, because the Europeans cut everything for 400 or 500 years ago. And now we're like, oh, we understood that was wrong. Don't do this, dude. Which is kind of an equal situation to the countries which are developing later. That's the first question. The second question, if you're dealing with carbon credits, can we calculate how much the Amazon greens bring and just sell the carbon credits from the forest? I mean, there is a market, not optimal, not great, but there is. And just say, for keeping your trees, you're getting money. Would that work?
Absolutely. So two great questions. The first one is, it is the most unjust thing in a world full of injustice to tell people that you are not allowed to grow when I have grown, right? And so this is clearly not the answer. And so this is why we're working on these kind of green jobs. So if you think about the world history, we had blue collar and white collar jobs. So after the Industrial Revolution, lots of people worked in coal plants, and we made loads of money for that generation in Europe. And then we have white collar jobs where we do lots and lots of work on the information technology areas. And now each of those generations that did those had incredible prosperity. And so with these green collar jobs, where, for example, you're selling kind of high value luxury goods like chocolate, while preserving your environment and getting rewarded for both, that's the shift that we need to engender in these economies. So things like these Gola projects have been incredible, but at a very small scale. So we need to replicate these projects just everywhere, which leads on to your second question. The problem is that the global economy is highly biased against nature preservation. So you make less money if you preserve the forest. And so there's been lots and lots of reports on natural capital and how we can incorporate this into the economy. But fundamentally, it's this notion of a GDP, which tells us that the more we consume, the better our countries are doing. And you see this in the UK with all of these cuts and stuff going on right now. It doesn't measure anything of significance with respect to our resources. And so we have to incorporate natural capital into our economic thinking in order to bring this in. And that's kind of the point of some of this stuff. And then the land that these countries own will be the most valuable land on the planet because it will contain the last defensible area where species live. You can't move it. And right now, it's some of the cheapest land in the world. So there's a lot of money to be made for these people if we can shift our economy. But it's not happening right now.
Thank you. There's one question from the back, and then another here later.
How has your experience been working kind of against the interests of huge corporations Do you ever feel pushback?
Yes, there's a lot of that. So well, it's pushback from everyone, right? So the press, for example, reports just the worst elements of our research. So we did all this research in carbon credits, and we said that the estimation of these projects is a little bit off, but they're still beneficial, but not as beneficial as they claim. And 10% of those projects are amazing and doing really well. Then the headline of The Guardian is 90% of all forest projects are a waste of time. They're all scams. And then, the 10% that were like Gola just had no money so far. And so the press makes money from, the bad stuff and really from reinforcing good behaviors. And then companies it's just kind of shocking how badly aligned some of their incentives are. So I've been to lots of events about ecological risk and commercial activities. And there's a lot of bullshit going on there where the people claim that they'll have it, but what you have to do is just ignore what they're all saying and look at how they make money. Okay, so if you have an insurance company, for example, they will tell you we are really worried about climate change because it increases the chance of correlated failures, right? And then they have to do a big payout. Then you ask them, what are you doing about it? And they'll say we're raising the premiums for everyone right now. So in other words, if you read what they're doing, they're making money today from climate change because there's a few events. And then when London floods, they'll get bailed out by the government, right? So there's zero fundamental risk there, and they're making money right now. They don't want to fix their climate. So we do need a good activist profile in order to figure out how to address this. I don't have the answers, unfortunately, but I am angry.
Actually, that was my question. I'm going to come to yours. It's not a question, but that was one of the things that I was thinking, oh my God, we are all doing this thing. Like one of the challenges people have is to be able to imagine how worse things are going to get, right? So the kind of your project is really helping people to be able to pick, imagine in the purest form of the meaning of the word imagine, right? Picture it in their head. But then how about ethical imagination? How are we going to help people care enough to make a change or stop that from happening? Yeah. And cost is one of the excuses, I think.
Absolutely.
We can use against those bodies. No, it's going to be very costly for you, kind of. And then maybe at that point we'll need to
fix things, right?
Yeah.
So there is one thing about imagination, actually. Let me spend 1 minute, if I have 1 minute, just to explain this one to you. So let's accelerate to 2150. The world's population is stable. We're now hitting a net zero economy. Capitalism, in terms of its consumptive model, has basically stopped. So if we have to imagine, what does that economy look like? What does day-to-day life look like in this world where we have a fixed number of humans and we're all trying to find balance? And there are economic theories that make this work. And I'll sketch it out for you very quickly. So let's say we all have pieces of art and we are all trying to make sure this art gets the people that like it the most, okay? So one way to do this is that each of you define a price for your own art. And you say, this is the price that I set for it based on what I like. Then say every week we have an auction. And if anyone else wants to buy that art, they have to pay the price. You have to sell it to them, okay, if they want to buy it. You have no choice. But if no one buys it, then you have to pay a universal basic income tax. If you price the art too high, you pay lots of tax. So you'll naturally year on year lower the value of your own art until you're forced to sell it. And then they will do the same thing. And eventually all of the art ends up in the right kind of place. So in other words, it's an allocatively efficient way of running an economy. It doesn't work in capitalism because the rich people will buy all the art. But there are mechanisms by which you can say that if we just forget capitalism for a second and construct a narrative where we have a future world that has a different kind of economy, you can actually build simulations that show you that this is a system known as harbinger taxes used in the Victorian times, where there are mechanisms by which you can price things such that the rich people don't buy them all. The problem is we don't really know what the transition is. But I'm trying not to worry about the transition right now. I'm just saying, what does stability look like? What does success look like? And then you can use your imagination and say, okay, these are new economies in which we can run this thing, and then figure out how do we protect those new economies against the current economy? Because the current economy will destroy the planet in its business as usual form, and that's not good enough. But we need some safe spaces to use our imagination as well. And so that's where some of these future histories and stories like that are really good. So if everyone wants to play around with new tax systems and new models of societies, I'm always happy to have that conversation.
Thank you. And Alex, thank you for your patience.
So thank you for the presentation. It was really fascinating. I suppose what I was thinking about, sort of partway through the presentation is a methodological
Mhm.
one. And it's, I suppose there's a lot of real promise between sort of geographic information systems and modern remote sensing in allowing you to capture data across these sort of areas that you ordinarily just wouldn't be able to do on the ground. And it's sort of clear with, counting a tree coverage, how much promise there is. But I suppose what I wondered is how do you sort of as a team and as a researcher balance that with the need to validate that with the ground truth ultimately at the end of the day, especially sort of if you're looking at questions of causality across settings like the Amazon, where you're also spanning several countries in regulatory environments. So what role does ground reporting and the ground game, I guess, play in your research?
No, it's huge. It's a really important question. When you do machine learning, if there's no validation pipeline for the results, basically ignore it. So it's just random results, right? So for everything we do, in the specific case of trees, over the last 50 years, there's been several longitudinal studies, hundreds of them around the world, called forest carbon or forest biodiversity plots. And ecologists goes there every year, and with a microscope, they basically measure every living thing they can find and they record it. So we use those as anchor points for things. But in the case of other causal effects, such as livelihoods, there's massive randomized controlled trials. The Campbell collaboration is a big kind of collaboration of people around the world to do that. So we tap into all of those existing really, really hard bits of work that have happened over 50 years. The danger point is now AI is percolating into all the results that people have put in. So we can't really use anything since 2022, right? Unless it's been verified as being human generated. So it is getting harder now. But we still have lots of the data from the past, and it's only 2024. But the next few years are going to be tricky. We're going to have to tackle this head on. So it's a great thought.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Guys, please join me in thanking Professor Anil Madhavapeddy.
Thank you, Stefan, for hosting me.
Thank Elena Scully, Alex Pim, and Velvet Young for making today happen. They've done a lot of background
Yes.
work that you are not aware of. Thank you.
Thank you all.